Just into CNN, new data out of Israel, which is already administering a fourth dose of the COVID vaccine for certain groups. This study shows a fourth shot of either the Pfizer or Moderna mRNA vaccines boosts antibodies even more than a third dose. But the effect still may not be enough to protect against breakthrough Omicron infections, according to the preliminary data. And here to discuss, epidemiologist and former Detroit Health Commissioner Dr. Abdul El-Sayed. Doctor, thank you for being here. Based on this data, does a fourth dose seem warranted to you, or should we really focus on an Omicron-specific vaccine that Pfizer says will be ready as soon as March?
Well, at this point, I'll be honest with you, given how fast Omicron has surged and also how fast it seems to be abating in the places that it has affected, I actually don't know that either of these is going to be timely in order to be able to take on Omicron. If you think about it, when it comes to just third doses, only about 38% of Americans have availed themselves of that. And then you think about how fast it might take, how quickly we might be able to get an Omicron-specific booster, and March seems to have missed the boat entirely. And then when it comes to a fourth vaccine, perhaps for folks who are immunocompromised or are seniors, that may be a helpful approach here. But even if it's not going to protect against breakthrough cases, we know that a third dose in and of itself protects against serious illness. And so given what we know about Omicron, I don't know that this data suggests that we should be doing anything more than what we're doing right now. And if for folks who have not gotten their third dose, please do so. That is the probably the most important intervention that you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones.
And you're right, it's the third dose that right now the U.S. is focused on. But the former FDA chief, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, has said that he thinks we may need annual COVID boosters, at least for a while. Do you agree with that? And I think a lot of people are thinking, when does this end? When does it stop?
Well, on the one hand, Dr. Scott Gottlieb is, of course, the former FDA chief. On the other, he's also a board member of Pfizer. The other point I'll make about this is that we just don't know what endemic COVID looks like. We're still in pandemic COVID. And so I think there's a lot to learn about the evolution of this virus under endemic conditions when, of course, we're not gripped by this, but it's something more akin to the flu or a cold, something seasonal that some group of people are going to get, but it's not taking over our society in the way that Omicron is right now. And we have a lot more to learn about where research on vaccines goes from here. I'd really like to see a pan-COVID vaccine, and that is a potential scientific possibility. Of course, we're not there yet. And so I do think it's a little early now to talk about annual shots. That might be the case, of course, but we just don't know the conditions of endemic COVID right now, and we don't know where vaccine research is going. So I think we get through this moment and then look up and say, okay, what is and how is this virus behaving? How is it shaping our illness patterns in this country and beyond? And then what do we do to protect ourselves from there?
New York, where I am, has been hit really hard by Omicron. It feels like everybody knows somebody at the very least who's been infected if their family wasn't directly impacted. But the good news is the positivity rate for this state just dropped by a full 10% from 23% a couple of weeks ago to around 13% positivity now. That brings a lot of, I think, silver lining at least and glimmer of hope for people here. But the Surgeon General is still warning we shouldn't expect to see similar trends in other places just yet. Let's watch.
There are parts of the country, New York in particular, and other parts of the Northeast, where we are starting to see a plateau and in some cases an early decline in cases. The challenge is that the entire country is not moving at the same pace. The Omicron wave started later in other parts of the country, so we shouldn't expect a national peak in the next coming days. Next few weeks will be tough.
Given that, when do you expect the country will be past this Omicron surge?
Well, you know, in the part of the country where I am here in Michigan, we've always been hit by surges about a month after the largest cities in the country, places like New York or Seattle or Boston. And so what you're seeing here is that though larger cities who are hit first may be beyond their Omicron peak, a lot of the rest of parts of the country, where, by the way, fewer people tend to be vaccinated or boosted if they are vaccinated, in those parts of the country, the worst may be yet to come. And so there is a prolonged American experience, even if the largest cities may be over it. So, you know, when are we going to be over with? When are we going to start seeing that end of the upside down V in communities like Michigan or in the South? Probably in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And until then, it really is critical for folks who haven't gotten their booster. I'm going to say this again, please do. It's the best single thing you can do to protect yourself. And, you know, we've got to batten down the hatches patches, do what we can to protect ourselves and our loved ones, and hope that we can get through this together.
Yeah, full disclosure, I got COVID a couple of weeks ago, and I was boosted. I didn't even realize I had it until I got tested, because I had a slight runny nose and was with somebody, had close contact with somebody who had already tested positive. I accredit that to the booster, and hardly feeling the impact. I was so grateful. Feel very fortunate that that was my COVID experience. Dr. Abdul Al-Sayed, thank you for your time and your expertise. Appreciate it.
And as always, thank you, and thank you for sharing that.
Joining us now, Dr. Paul Offit, physician in the Infectious Diseases Division at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's also a member of the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. Dr. Offit, it's always great to have you on. Look, in New York, it does look like cases have peaked and have started to slow. Hospitalizations plateaued, started to drop. Boston, the wastewater, just plummeting there, and cases seem to be slowing down. Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., these are the places that were hit first and worst. So what does that tell us?
Well, it's a winter virus. I mean, independent what variant is circulating in this country. Remember, if you look last year, when we really, in December, January, February, when we didn't really have much in the way of vaccinations, we didn't have much in the way of population immunity from natural infections. Still, by mid-February, you saw a dramatic decline in the number of hospitalizations and the number of deaths because it's a winter virus. So I think by the end of January, certainly by no later than mid-February, almost independent of what virus is circulating, you would expect to see a decline.
So, Doctor, let me ask you, as we talk about the end of this surge, I know there are a lot of Americans who are obviously very exhausted with dealing with the pandemic. There are certainly a lot who feel they want to move on. But one group of people who can't really, and I'm in this category, I have a 2.5-year-old son. He can't get vaccinated, which, in addition to, of course, worrying about his health, also has all of these policy implications in terms of quarantines and schools and daycares being closed. What is your take on that population? Where do the studies for the vaccinations stand? And do you think we should be changing some of these draconian policies that are keeping kids out of school for days on end, where they can't do the test to return the way now some of these older children can?
Right. So in answer to your first question, when can we expect the vaccine? Hard to know. Initially, Pfizer had said at a CDC meeting that they planned to submit data in April. More recently, Dr. Fauci has said March. I'm on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. We haven't been specifically told that there's going to be any date, at least in the immediate future, when we're going to be reviewing these data. So we'll see. In terms of measures, in terms of going back to school, I agree with you completely. I think that for the most part, we need to have children back in school. I mean, they have suffered this lack of socialization more than anyone else. And I think that just practical guidelines of just to the extent that you can mask wear, to the extent that you can social distance, and do the best we can to get back in there, because we're almost there. I really do think within the next, say, 3 to 4 to 5 weeks, you're going to see a dramatic decline in the incidence of this illness. And we're going to feel better, at least as we get into spring, summer, and early fall, and then presumably next winter, we'll see somewhat of a surge that's presumably less than this surge.
There is one thing I know you watch carefully, though. As great as it would be for children younger than 5 to be able to take the vaccine, in older children who are eligible now, it's not like there's a giant, massive uptake. It's still, it's about half or even less, depending on what age group.
No, it's frustrating. We talk about how desperately we want a vaccine for children, and then we get them and don't use them. Only about 50% of 12 to 15-year-olds have been vaccinated, which means 50% haven't. Only about 25 to 30% of 5 to 11-year-olds have been vaccinated. We've had a vaccine available since the beginning of November. Nonetheless, about 75% of children in that age group aren't vaccinated. What's frustrating for me is when I'm on service at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, we admit a lot of children over 5 years of age, and what they all share in common, for the most part, is none of them are vaccinated. None of their family members are vaccinated, siblings, parents, which is generally where they get it from. Having a vaccine isn't good enough. You actually have to administer it.
Right, that is the frustrating part. So let's talk a little bit about some new information that we're learning. There is a study out about NBA players, and that has been a leading indicator, actually, in so many ways throughout this pandemic. But the study found that many of these players were still infected even after 5 days of having the virus. What does this mean in the context of the CDC guidelines that reduced that quarantine period from 10 to 5 days?
Yeah, I think the problem with that study was the test that they used to see whether or not you were COVID positive was a PCR test, which looks for viral genome, which is that blueprint in the center of viruses that tell the virus how to reproduce itself. What you really want to know is infectious virus. What's the quantity of infectious virus that's being secreted? Now, neither the antigen test nor the PCR test tell you that, but there have been studies looking at trying to compare PCR testing with the quantity of infectious virus that you're excreting, which is to say the degree to which you're infectious. And what they found is there's not a great correlation, especially for people who are vaccinated. If you're vaccinated, you're going to shed far less virus for far shorter period of time. So I think that was the problem with the study. I actually liked the CDC guidelines when they came out initially, which is that if you're COVID positive and symptomatic, quarantine yourself until you're not symptomatic anymore, and then mask. And I think that's probably the best idea because the testing, especially the PCR testing, can be misleading.
All right, Dr. Paul Offit, thank you as always. We really appreciate your expertise and thanks for being here today.
Thank you.